Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of the life of John Mason, the man who would be credited with the founding of New Hampshire, as far as English colonization is concerned. Now, last week we developed his early life. John Mason was born in 1586 to a well-to-do family and benefited from an education that included both Peterhouse College at Cambridge and Magdalen College at Oxford. His studies included navigation, astronomy, cartography, mathematics, seamanship. He was well equipped for the life that lay ahead. Although his college years listed his address as Southampton County, which included the town of Portsmouth, he was married in his hometown of King's Lynn in 1606, and his wife's name was Anne Green. And we'll soon see that Portsmouth would become a very integral part of his life and his legacy. Now, John Mason's career included naval service, piracy, anti-piracy, governorship, and extensive notes and maps of the Newfoundland colony, the accuracy of which served to correct misinformation of the island and encourage Scottish colonization. John Mason had also, in my opinion, been cheated by the powers that were. He had not been reimbursed when he had successfully completed his commission by the king to aid the Bishop of the Isles, Andrew Knox, in establishing ecclesiastical authority over the people of the Hebrides. In fact, this failure to gain reimbursement led the Privy Council to grant him the assize of Herring in the northern seas. But if you remember, the Dutch flat out ignored him, and his own countrymen had him imprisoned. He had considerable context for his day as well. The Earl of Dunbar, the Treasurer of Scotland, Sir William Alexander, the future Earl of Stirling, Ferdinand Gorges, and there will be more in this episode. And as we left John Mason, he had just left Newfoundland for reasons not completely known. And he had hooked up with his old acquaintance, Ferdinand Gorges, and was again being influenced by the Earl of Stirling. And I wanted to review these things because to me, it underscores just how busy and just how industrious John Mason was. It seems he had already lived several lifetimes. Those times were really just the beginning. He was only around 35 years old at this point, and his energy makes me tired. As we left him last week, we reintroduced a person and a council that we've mentioned in the past, and I want to develop a little more here before we bring John Mason back. It's really going to add context and depth to his story and to ours. So after John Mason left Newfoundland, he was quickly involved in another venture to the New World. And the influencers and enablers here were the aforementioned Earl of Stirling, Ferdinand Gorges, and the Council for New England. And of these, Ferdinand Gorges is most significant. Simply put, Gorges is recognized as the founder of Maine. But, like John Mason, that simply does not tell the tale. This was another very accomplished, very influential man in his day, a household name. Easy to research, but not always a common name in the popular history books. Another character who was not allowed to frame the argument or make the primary case for his legacy. Now, as a spoiler alert, he is, in my opinion, which I hope to develop over the next several episodes, another character that has been marginalized by those that won the day, by those that had a different worldview and simply outlasted him, namely the Puritans. Ferdinand Gorges had an extensive career that spanned the time between the Spanish Armada in 1588 and the surrender of Charles I in 1645. And like John Mason, he was born into a prominent family in Dorset and was well educated. He enjoyed a military career, a political career, and a lot of influence in the English colonial games. It was in the struggle against Spanish aggression where he distinguished himself. First in Holland, and later in France, where he helped Henry IV. You might remember him from way back in episode 3. Previously, his name was Henry Navarre, the guy whose wedding had sparked the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Henry III's successor, the one who established the House of Bourbon. Henry IV, a Huguenot. Yes, Ferdinando Gorges was there. His participation on those events got him knighted by the Earl of Essex, and a little later he was appointed the commander of Plymouth by Elizabeth herself. And that was a marquee assignment. He was tasked with the responsibility of preparing the defenses of the western counties from Spanish attacks. Things were going very well for Gorges up until this time. Unfortunately, his old friend, the Earl of Essex, became embroiled in a plot against the Queen, a plot that was found out. Gorges was implicated. And at the trial, he testified against Essex. He kept his head, but he lost his appointment. He would recover, obviously, but hereafter, Ferdinand Gorges would always support the monarchy. That's an important point as we move forward. In 1608, at the accession of James I, he was reappointed to the post at Plymouth, and this is where his story really picks up steam. It's at this time that he gained an interest in colonization, and his influence would be far-reaching, very far-reaching. So in 1605, George Weymouth, another character that we've talked about, it's funny how the same guys seem to keep popping up. It's good. It keeps the narrative honest. George Weymouth returned from North America with 5 natives. Gorges kept 3 for himself to learn about their homeland. And in 1606, Gorges began to promote the Virginia Company. So he had enjoyed a celebrated military career in 2 theaters, had been knighted, was placed in charge of the security of Plymouth, and now he was responsible for reorganizing the Plymouth portion of the Virginia Company in North America. And you remember, colonization had not come easy. There had been a multitude of failed ventures, like Popham Colony to come in 1607. That was one of Gorges. Gorges was also commissioner for the regulation of Newfoundland fisheries. And there's more. I feel like I'm a host of one of those cheesy game shows or those late-night infomercials that peddle various wares to the insomniac. And there's more. But it's true. There was more. If nothing else, these guys had ambition and energy. Now, from his post at Plymouth, Gorges oversaw the preparing and the fitting of the ships destined for the New World fishing, trade, and exploration, all with the idea of colonization as the end game. That was the driving motivation for the 1620s Plymouth Company. And there he sat, taking it all in, seeing what worked and what didn't through the lens of other men's investments, all the while learning more and more from folks like the natives brought to him by George Weymouth. Isn't this fascinating? I'd love to talk to this guy. Just ask him questions and then listen to his answers from his own worldview at that time. It's like the world was not just one oyster. It was several oysters for Ferdinand Gorges. Which one to open first? Now, ultimately, Gorges received a new charter, which led to the creation of the Council for New England. And it contained 40 prominent members of English society. Their goal was not to personally found colonies, but rather to help others found colonies. And one of their first grants, and easily one of their most famous, was to the Pilgrims. The members of the council were also given tracts of land. In 1622, Gorges received his, along with John Mason. Gorges did attempt one colony in 1623. Now, he stayed in Plymouth, but he had sent his son, Robert, and that colony failed the following year. So with that little bit of background, let's return to John Mason. But don't worry, we're not quite done with Ferdinand Gorges just yet. We'll return to his story as well. So when John Mason returned to England, there were talks to colonize Nova Scotia. Then it was being considered New Scotland, that area just to the south of Newfoundland. And it was at this time that Gorges and Mason received their land patent for all the territory between the Merrimack and the Kennebec rivers, basically Maine. Now, hold that thought. I know we're holding a lot right now, but we're going to tie this all up, I promise. We're going to finish this portion later. Mason had more than just this going on, a lot more. So fasten your seatbelts. In addition to the land with Gorges, Mason received a second grant. This one fell between the Naumkeag and the Merrimack rivers. It was 1622. And the following year, in 1623, he was still seeking to obtain certain fish that he was owed back in Newfoundland. This guy was all over the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. So by 1624, John Mason had settled his family back in Portsmouth, England. Then war struck. Well, 2 wars struck. In 1625, it was Spain, and in 1627, it was France. Well, it could have been 1624 or 1625 for Spain, or 1626 or 1627 for France, depending on whether your resource was recorded under the Julian or the Gregorian calendar. It's another one of those issues. We're going to go with 1625 for Spain and 27 for France. Some of the books and references that I used went with the earlier dates. So if I intersperse that, it's just a technicality. It's still the same war. Sorry, we'll work through that. At any rate, he played a role here that took him out of the colonial games for quite a while. For our purposes, he was really only padding his resume. In 1625, King James died, and Charles I assumed the throne, and he promptly went to war with Spain. Mason was made commissary general and put in charge of outfitting the Cadiz expedition. The following year, he was made treasurer and paymaster of all English forces. That's a big deal. Now, here's how these appointments went down and the consequences thereof. At the outbreak of the war with Spain, again in 1625, the Duke of Buckingham was put in charge. It was at this time, while Mason was serving under Sir Edward Cecil, that he received the high post of commissary general. And he may have received this because of his cousin Robert, who had actually been the Duke of Buckingham's secretary. He may have mentioned John Mason's administrative skills. So again, we see John Mason was a very connected man with men in high positions. Now, the Cadiz expedition was an absolute failure, and primarily because of poor provision, like the English Armada 40 years earlier. It's an odd thing, though. Mason's reputation was preserved. Edward Cecil complimented him on his skills. The real problem was that the failure of the Cadiz expedition had a negative impact on all of the ports in the South, and none more than Portsmouth. This poor town actually received a double whammy. First, there was the returning or the arriving scads of seamen that were hungry, disease-ridden, wounded, unemployed, broke. And then there were the contracts lost. The shipping industry that had helped fuel the town was losing contracts to the dockyards on the Thames. There's really nothing new under the sun, is there? It seems that all societies and nations and regions have their ups and downs. We always like to think, like us personally, our own generation or our region is somehow special when it comes to the misery index, but we're not. So the struggle continued until war broke out with France in 1627. And with that, both Portsmouth and John Mason, one of its most prominent citizens, was recognized for its true strategic value. And on top of that, the Duke of Buckingham was back in charge. He planned to attack New Rochelle and give aid to the Huguenots. And this is when John Mason was tapped as the treasurer and paymaster, not of the Navy, but of the Army. This assignment could not have been better executed by John Mason. He seems to have pulled off the impossible. He secured 6,000 soldiers without upsetting the general population. He was able to garner the funds to pay for their room and board promptly. He had arranged and planned the right clothing for the right men on the right vessels. And when they showed up, they were accurately directed to their stations, at least 6,000 men. Even their return went smoother than one could ever have expected. Mason managed to secure their pay very quickly. That never happened. So, as a sidebar here, kind of a soapbox and opinionated observation, the same guys, if you'll notice, keep coming up over and over again in our storyline, sometimes successful and sometimes not, but usually affiliated with the same group of leadership, guys like the Duke of Buckingham. Also, the armed forces are necessary, but they often lack support after the need has passed. It all seems so contemporary, doesn't it? So predictable, so common. Yet it's reasonable when you consider the aspect of men in public service, of politics or military. And it's sad for veterans, isn't it? They are, after all, a line item on an expense ledger. It's pretty sad to distill it down that way, but it seems to ring true over and over again. And if you recall, that's one of the things that made Henry VII such a visionary. The idea and the initial implementation of a national navy, perpetually maintained. That's expensive. End of soapbox. So Mason's job was well executed. The attack on New Rochelle was not. It was repelled. Buckingham's reputation took a big hit. On a brighter side, Portsmouth was once again recognized as essential, and the money came pouring back in, largely by Buckingham's efforts. So later, when Buckingham suggested another assault on New Rochelle, it was not so well received. Not even the hometown hero John Mason could raise support. I mean, by now, he was in charge of Plymouth and Portsmouth. The problem in Plymouth had more to do with corruption, and Portsmouth was just reluctant to get involved. Money was short. Buckingham got all the blame. Mason escaped again with his reputation intact. The stress from this time actually caused Mason to temporarily retire for health reasons. I mean, that's ugly. So we just kind of glossed over that, but think about that. He had run himself ragged into the ground. It got much uglier for Buckingham. It all came to a very public head in August of 1628. Now, here's what happened. John Mason did return to service. He was determined to fix the financial woes of the army. He took on a lot. All the funds were to go directly through him. He would directly oversee the payment of the men. He must have been wildly popular with those serving. And he also wanted to keep good records for the king. Now think about that. In a day and an age without modern technology and computers, without typewriters even, that's a tough assignment. There was also systematic corruption and overcrowding in the town for the servicemen themselves. In August of that year, John Mason entertained the Duke of Buckingham at his house. Make no mistake, the Duke's reputation had taken a hit, but he was still the most well-known and one of the most powerful men in England. Now, while he visited Mason, things got ugly. I mean, think mob, think fear, think poverty, think frustration, think anger, think overcrowding. Now, project all of those emotions on one person and bring the mob real close. As Buckingham was making his way to Southwick to visit the king, his carriage was assaulted by the mob. Not just his carriage, his person. I mean, it seems Buckingham being Buckingham. When his carriage was assaulted, he emerged from it and grabbed a guy from the crowd, a would-be assailant, and hauled him into Mason's house. And he then proceeded along his way. That in and of itself must have been quite a scene. He jumps off the carriage into this crowd, grabs some guy, hauls him off into John Mason's house, and then storms back off to his carriage and rides away. Well, the crowd was still there. Tempers were still flaring. So after the Duke of Buckingham left, the crowd turned their attention to Mason's house and promptly threatened to destroy it. So wisely, John Mason let the guy from the crowd go. I wonder what the crowd that day thought of Mason at this point. I mean, did they just see him as almost like a spectator? Did they suddenly see their hometown hero as the enemy? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm guessing for the most part he was forgiven, but they must have had a good sense to differentiate between he and Buckingham. I mean, it's not always the case, is it? It seems to me quite often there's a kind of a guilt by association in these types of situations, and questions are only asked, if they're asked at all, after unnecessary damage has been done to somebody's person or to their reputation. So anyway, the guy was released, and that was that, for a while. That was early August. But here's where the for a while card was cashed in. August 23rd, just a few weeks later. There was a crowd gathered outside of Mason's house that morning, waiting to see Buckingham. Among them was a young army lieutenant named John Felton, and he wasn't there to talk. He had grievances that he blamed on Buckingham. And when the Duke entered Mason's hallway, Felton attacked him with a knife. I mean, he didn't just attack him. He stabbed him. He didn't just stab him, he killed him. That's kind of a bummer, for the Duke anyways. But the big win for Portsmouth at this time was the position that it had been elevated to. It was now recognized as the most important naval harbor. The South Sea Castle was restored, and John Mason was named its captain in 1634. So, after the early years of colonial governor, Navy guy, pirate, anti-pirate, businessman, then commissary general, treasurer, and paymaster, all while maintaining a good reputation. I mean, he'd come a long way from the days of assize in the northern seas off that Scottish coast. And the people he knew, people who recognized and elevated him time and time again. I mean, man, any one of those accomplishments would have been significant in and of itself, even the piracy. But now, captain of an important strategic outpost. The war had ended in 1629, and with that, Mason turned his attention back to his business interests. And these included the fishing industry around the Scottish Isle of Lewis and the New World. And he reunited with Ferdinand Gorges and was granted the land that he would call New Hampshire. But he wasn't done. In fact, Mason, Gorges, and other partners founded the Laconia Company to develop land on Lake Champlain, much farther west, where the French and the Dutch were already. Another colony on the Piscataway, Mason's land, was settled in 1630. In 1632, he became not just a member, but in short order, vice president of the Council for New England. And when the council dissolved in 1635, it was John Mason who was named Vice Admiral of New England. You get that? Vice Admiral of New England. The council had dissolved in part due to Massachusetts Bay's success and influence. It's kind of like two parallel power brokers active at the same time, heading for a collision. The Mason-Gorges group and the Puritans. They had very different views on what colonialism should look like, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But back at home, John Mason was still very active as well. In 1633, King Charles granted a charter for an association for the Three Kingdoms, for a general fishery. Mason was the treasurer, and the targeted goal was to interrupt the Dutch fishing industry. And I'll bet Mason relished this post after what he had gone through 2 decades earlier. Remember, this is also about the time that he was named the captain of the South Sea Castle. And he was also named the inspector of all of the forts and all of the castles on the South Coast. I mean, are you tired yet? This guy's got endless energy. He's lived like 5 lives at this point. The guy is definitely not a sloucher. I mean, if you're looking for a colonial role model, you could do a lot worse than John Mason. Now, as we close this episode out, I want to return for a few minutes to our friend and John Mason's partner, Ferdinand Gorges. Let's fill in a few gaps that we left, a few things that we did not explicitly cover, and also round out how Gorges fared during the war years. I mean, we covered Mason already, and how these two managed once they reunited. It's important to realize, as I alluded to earlier, that these guys had a very different view of what colonization should look like in comparison to the Puritans who had begun to settle southern New England. At the time, Mason and Gorges were approaching from the north. Now, Mason and Gorges were not dissidents, like the Puritans. Gorges's goal was to colonize like an Englishman, aristocratic Englishman, feudalism with an emphasis on Anglicanism as the state religion. That represented a very different view than the other groups coming to New England at this time. Groups in a roundabout way that had benefited from Gorges' work without benefiting him personally. In fact, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay had actually circumvented the Council for New England and had received royal charters. When war had broken out with France in 1627, Gorges had abandoned his interest in the Council for New England. And with that, he had missed his opportunity to oversee the grant to the New England Company in 1628, and they're remembered as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, after the war with France, Gorges tried to get the Puritan charter canceled. Not a small matter. It almost worked. His goal was to control them. I mean, surprise, surprise, right? Everybody in this day and age wants to control everybody else. But Gorges' argument, which makes sense from their time in history, was that a strict Puritan colony undermined the unity that the English government wanted and so desperately needed. And after 3 years, he won that claim, and it was decided that Massachusetts Bay would have to defend its charter. Gorges became the Governor General of New England in 1635. That's the same year that John Mason had been made the Vice Admiral. So you've got the Governor General and the Vice Admiral. And the plan was for Gorges to present the order to Massachusetts Bay along with his partner, John Mason. I mean, that would have been an interesting showdown, the Puritans and the anti-Puritans. But this time, we've looked at Massachusetts Bay from a host of angles at this point, and they really are kind of bullies, and they'll get a whole lot more belligerent after the Pequot War. But if this showdown had ever really taken place, this would have been power against power. But the voyage never happened. As they were leaving for New England, the ship, quote unquote, broke apart, and John Mason died, and the trip was canceled. Massachusetts Bay was left alone. Now, from a time frame perspective, this was just before the controversies erupted, first over Roger Williams, and then Anne Hutchinson and the Antinomian controversy. Now, Gorges made one more major attempt in 1639 at colonization. He had received the charter for Maine. A government was set up and things were moving forward. But then there was the breakdown of civility and the encroachment of the English Civil War, and age finally seemed to have caught up with this ageless wonder. And again, like his longtime friend and partner, Gorges had enjoyed a long career that included military service, administrative appointments, and colonial enterprise. It's pretty amazing. 50 years of public service. Like Mason, he had survived earlier mistakes. Mason survived his piracy. Gorges survived his part in the plot against Queen Elizabeth. Two men so similar and seemingly bound together for so many years. At the time of his death, John Mason had not been across the Atlantic for a long time. And with that and the abandonment of the trip by Ferdinand Gorges, Massachusetts Bay took over. They soon dominated New Hampshire for decades, until 1679. In the case of Maine, it was centuries, 1820 to be exact, when statehood was achieved. Now, with that, we've covered a lot of ground on how the remainder of early New England was settled by the English. The goal was to introduce the big picture, and as we move forward, these names and places should be more familiar. There's just a couple of points to ponder as we say goodbye for today in a game of what if. What if the Gorges-Mason bunch had succeeded in getting the Puritan charter revoked? What would the New World have looked like? I mean, it's just a small sliver on a global scale. England would probably still have ruled the world at one point, but that tiny sliver, those 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America, what would they have looked like had the Puritans not been able to keep their stronghold? What would the landscape of England have looked like at the outbreak of the coming Civil War if the Puritans had been forced to stay in England? I mean, would there have been a civil war? They represented quite the brain drain and the manpower when they left England. Who would we be studying and focusing in our popular history if Gorges had had his day? What would the like of John Winthrop be? Would he have been the B team at this point, the secondary guys, the what-ifs? Would the boys from Boston have provoked the revolution a century and a half later? You remember, Gorges was very loyal to the monarchy. Would New England, with its feudal system, have looked more like Virginia? What about native relations? Or Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson? Would they even have been there? I mean, would they even have had a problem? What about the regions from Newfoundland through Rhode Island? Would they have been held together? Because, Gorges and Mason had influence in all of those areas. Would that all be the U.S. now? Would it be Canada? Would there have been a population explosion like there was? Also, I think it's very interesting to realize that these events did not take place in a vacuum. There was the 30 Years' War going on, the jockeying with not just Spain and France, but the Netherlands. Internally, England was a mess, and Charles's ascension to the throne had not helped. In all of that, John Mason navigated a world where he had enjoyed success and failure. He was a stand-up naval guy and a pirate. He knew and served at the request of some of the most powerful, influential people of his day. He had served as governor in Newfoundland. His military experience was utilized in England and the New World. He was a successful businessman. He was responsible for the security of the southern coastline against Spanish aggression at a time when Spain ruled the world. His colony of New Hampshire would one day offer refuge to a fleeing John Wheelwright for picking the wrong side during the Antinomian controversy. John Mason was quite a man for any age. His contributions to his generation seem, To me, almost incalculable. An extraordinary life. One whose legacy seems overshadowed by those of his time that were allowed to frame the better arguments. Arguments from the winner's circle. His lasting legacy, as far as New England is concerned, is that he's credited with being the founder of the state of New Hampshire. In light of everything else, that seems almost a trivial remembrance. No offense to New Hampshire. One last thing. John Mason's colony of New Hampshire would also one day receive another victim of the Antinomian controversy, a trained soldier and one of its future governors, John Underhill. But that's a story for next time. And as for this time, I hope our time together has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.